Thank you so much. um, Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I am honored and very humbled to be able to do this. How many of you know who the Essenes or Gnostics were? Probably quite a few. Most of you seem to be fairly educated spiritually, so you've at least heard about them or read about them somewhat. With the time allotted, I'm going to just touch on some basic information today.
Move the mic a little closer or speak a little louder.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Is that better? A little better? Oh, okay. Now it's coming through? Okay. Okay. Okay, so with 30 minutes, I'm not going to speak about a whole lot. I'm just going to give you some basic information. And I want you to remember that anything I speak about could be controversial. You can also usually find the opposite in some book or somewhere. With that being said, I realize that everybody creates and translates through their own reality and their own perceptions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just speak about what has touched my heart, what means something to me, and then I'm just going to hope that it touches your heart and that you get something out of it. I ask that you pursue your own truth and your own path and find what really touches your spirit. But the Gnostics were a great group to listen to and read. So if you haven't read them, I encourage you to read them. There's a lot of books out there, and I can give those to you if you want them. The Essenes were the religious culture that Jesus was born and raised within. Mary and Joseph, of course, were both Essenes. His grandparents were Essenes. John the Baptist was his cousin, of course, so he was an Essene. Some of his disciples were Essenes. Some of them were even childhood friends that he grew up with. Over the last 100 years, we have been finding hundreds of their writings that were basically left out of the biblical text. The Essenes were and still are controversial as far as Christian history because a lot of the things they said actually are more or less the opposite of organized religion. They are becoming more acceptable as people turn away from our standard Orthodox religions and are looking for more of a complete truth. Since I feel Jesus' name is also controversial, and I personally have never really felt comfortable with that name, basically because it's just overused in religious circles, I would like to call him by his birth name, Yahshua. And that's not Yeshua, and I can tell you where I got that if anybody's interested, but it's Yahshua. When I was thinking about presenting today, I thought, how do you talk about something so vast, so interesting, and has so much power in 20 or 30 minutes? Well, the creator usually prevails and flashes things, and I flashed on a movie before my eyes, a movie that I saw over 40 years called The Jerk. Does anybody remember that movie with Steve Martin? I realized that in the beginning of this movie, it ties to a very important aspect of what the Essenes wanted us to know and understand. So it starts out, it's an old Steve Martin comedy in the 70s called The Jerk. The movie starts out with him saying in the script that he was raised as a poor black boy. And it pans him into the movie. It pans him as a young man sitting on the porch somewhere in the deep South with a black family around him. They're jamming, they're on banjos and guitars, and they're singing and they're dancing, and he's playing a harmonica and he's not keeping tune, and he's slapping his leg, but there's no rhythm there. I mean, you can tell he's just, he's not in sync. He can't dance, he can't keep a beat. But when he finishes the jam session and goes inside the house, his very wise black mother comes over, puts her arm around him, and tells him that it's time he knows the truth, that he was adopted. That's the whole comedy of the movie. But then she says, honey, you need to go out into the world and find out who you really are. That's the part I think God was trying to tell me here. How many of you know who you really are? If you do, you're among the few. And based on the songs and so forth, I think we're all starting to gravitate that direction of knowing who we are. But the Essenes are there to help. Like Steve in the movie, we're all have our different stories, our different pasts, our different beliefs, but they're not the whole story. They're not really even the correct story of who we really are. They're just a story. Even if we were happy, rich, beautiful, famous, and had the perfect childhood and lives, these are just not the whole story of who we are. Unfortunately, most of us don't have the perfect life, nor did we have the perfect childhood. Either way, many of our thoughts within us at times sound something like, I'm not good enough, I'm the wrong color, I'm the wrong size, I'm too fat, I'm too short, I'm too, whatever. I can't make a difference, no one loves me. We have these stories internally within us, and they disempower us. How often do we look in the mirror and say, I love you, I love you, I love you? That's maybe more of our correct story. Our organized religions, although they are full of many spiritual people, have told us over the last 2,000 years that we were conceived in sin and will die as sinners, destined to go to hell as completely undeserving and unworthy. Christ as the Son of God, but he's separate from us. God's even separate from us. They're off the planet. They're in heaven somewhere. Science hasn't done us any great favors either through history explaining who we are either. For the last 150 years since Darwin's theory, we've been told that we are nothing more than an accident in nature. We have evolved from amoebas. We're like a speck of dust on a grain of sand among billions of other grains of sand on this planet. And basically, I've even read that we're in a dead universe. This is what we've been told. Either way we look at it, internally or externally, we are totally being bombarded with that we're an accident. We don't have true value. And I think that's, and it's no wonder our planet is in the shape it's in because of these stories. And it's time for us to have a new story. And thank God for the Essenes because they brought this story to us. So now it's time for us to rewrite, just like Steve Martin when he went out. It is said in the scrolls, to know self is to know God. Maybe it's time to truly know ourselves so we can truly know God, our Creator. The Essenes scrolls were written to help us lead us to our true stories, to help us know who we truly are within ourselves. The Gnostics didn't see us the way others see us. They said basically, and this is my words, that we were biologically, spiritually tuned in and tapped into a living and growing and expanding universe, multiverse, which we are intimately connected to as one. Now quantum physics and science are also proving this very fact. These scrolls say that that there is nothing inherently sinful or bad about being human. That includes our bodies and our sexuality. Being human isn't a punishment. We were not created in sin. We do not need to transcend our humanness. In fact, being human was the whole point of being here. We are the Creator. We are God in form to experience in physicality. We are magnificent beings of light and love. We were created in love. We are love in motion, God in form, and God expressing. From our scriptures, we've even heard this, but we tend to overlook it in Psalms and John. Don't you know you're God's? That's who we are. So this is a very different story than what we've been told and what we've been telling ourselves. It was important that we were to know ourselves. To know self was to know God. I'm going to say that probably a couple of times. And then some people say, oh, I know myself. I'm a doctor. I'm a PhD. I'm ordained. But it can be I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a father. But it can also be I'm an addict. I'm homeless. So It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, how we have these definitions of ourselves. It's just that it's still within the illusion. Shakespeare said, all the world is a stage. We're actors in these parts. In physicality, we're just actors here, and it can change in our next life. But we're much more than that. We change our story, we can actually change inside. So we're going to change our story, whatever our story is, to be more of who we really are. Theology, much like history, has been written for many different reasons and filtered through humans who had many different assumptions and internal beliefs. Our now Bible, unfortunately, was written at the time in history by the powers of the day to organize and control the masses of the Christ followers who were gathering. So there's many different interpretations. I read once that there's 1,200 different interpretations of our now Bible in English alone, not counting the other languages. The Bible, because it was the time it was written in history, much of the information has been removed. It's been left out. It's been altered. Although it's been a great book of inspiration for people for 2,000 years, I have read it many, many times. I just realized as I grew that there was a lot of things that were missing in it. It's a mere shell of what it should have contained. When I read the scrolls, it's very clear that the chain of knowledge has been broken many times through history and in many different ways for all of us. Because this information was lost, there's a huge gap in our spiritual awareness, our spiritual knowledge. It has stunted our spiritual growth, and it has stunted our spiritual evolution. We lost the knowing and accepting of who we are, so that's a huge part. This is the age of Aquarius, and as we enter this new age, I believe that wisdom and knowledge of the past is returning to us. And the scrolls were starting to be found in the 40s, and they're just really starting to be read and understood now. So, it's part of the Essenes and their scrolls are a part of the many pieces that are coming to life once again and bringing us back to this new age. I'm going to give you a little bit of Essene history. Basically, there were 4 religious groups around the time of Joshua: the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. The Essenes actually came from the Sadducees. They pulled away from the masses. They were basically considered the rebels of that day. They didn't always agree with the Torah, which were the first 5 books of the Bible, as they were trained to know the Creator from their heart. They were trained to know God from their heart. They believed that the letter or the written word could kill you. Thus, they didn't believe as much of the Old Testament of parts like God is a jealous or an angry God, vengeful. There are some statements in the Old Testament, but knowing God in their heart, they knew God that was a loving God. So they put away anything that didn't touch their heart. Even as rebels, they were well respected because of their spiritual awareness and wisdom. They were also greatly respected as healers. So they were the healers of the day. They eventually became known as the Gnostics, and the Gospels became known as the Gnostic Gospels. And that's from the word gnosis, N-O-U-S, meaning spiritual knowing or revelation. This was an internal knowing, but it was an internal knowing of transformation. So this was, again, more of a deep connection to the divine. This knowing you couldn't get from a book. It wasn't intellectual, but they understood and knew great truths. This was a wisdom that could only be found in the heart. And, this would be a whole nother talk, but the gnosis was almost a fourth dimensional transition into a spiritual place within themselves. They always taught that you must go within self to find this connection. The Essenes were also called the Nazarenes, and this is before the city of Nazareth or whatever, long before that. It means a vow of holiness and dedication to God. The Essene name actually means doctor or therapist. Egyptian called them the therapeutae, or the healers. They were the healers for Hebrews, Gentiles, Egyptians, any group within the area. They didn't care what religion you came from. They didn't care what you believed. They knew that they could heal you. They healed with plants and herbs of the earth, but they also used energy from their hands. So they laid on hands. They knew how to draw that energy from the source. They also used sound currents. They worked with the 14 angels of God that were taught by Enoch, and then were later taught by Joshua and his disciples in the Essene Gospels of Peace. And these 14 angels were energies or powers or creative forces in the universe that they would use to heal with. They were the supreme healers of their time and actually surpassed anything even in our time. And their path was to help the poor, sick, or hungry, whether human or animal, period. They spoke of a hidden, more human side of Joshua and the importance of Mary Magdalene's role as his partner with him. That our salvation has nothing to do with organized religion or sin, but that salvation is actually our evolution or awakening, an inward part and a very personal transformation. They were mostly vegetarian. They used milk and honey as they saw these as gifts from the animals. There's actually a scripture in the Gospels of Peace that says, "He who kills a beast kills his brother." So they were I think they might have eaten fish because they lived along the Dead Sea. And there are some scriptures about fish, and a couple of the disciples were fishermen. They possibly could have ate fish. We don't really know. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because she says, "Walk softly upon the earth, for she is very sacred." They believed, as the Native Americans do, that you could not own land as it belonged to Mother Earth. So the earth was very, very sacred to them. And you know that when I speak about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and so forth, those Gospels were not written by Mary Magdalene or Gospel of John wasn't written by Gospel of John. They were actually written by people who listened to him speak, and then they wrote later about him. So many of the Gospels were written anywhere from 100 to several hundred years after they were alive. And that's the biblical text as well. They only ate when the sun was highest in the heavens and again when it sets. They were really into balance, which was kind of interesting. They believed if you were overweight or underweight, you were out of balance. So I'm a little out of balance. They would bask in running water as a form of purification. They did this every morning, but it was a spiritual experience, not just a physical experience. That's where baptism in the churches came from. It was from a lot of this. They lived away from large populations. They lived along the Dead Sea in the Qumran area. They felt that the masses were too materialistic and greedy for them, and they simply chose a different path. They also didn't believe in animal sacrifice, and that was big in the Jewish population at that time. Nature, along with Gnosis, was their holy Bible. Gardening was essential and educational. They believed that nature was a key to understanding the entire universe, that all natural laws found in nature extend throughout the universe. White clothing was favored, especially regarding the priest. Joshua usually wore a white robe most of his life. I believe that they wore white so that anyone that they came in contact would know they were available to heal them. This was not used to put them on any kind of pedestal, but simply to make the masses aware that they were there for them. Mary, Christ's mother, also wore white all the time, but she was a healer as well before Christ. Sleep was important. They felt that dreams were a source of knowledge from God. They never really considered their own belongings. Now, I've read where it's like a little commune and they all had to share everything. It was more important than that because everything was balanced. So if you were poor or rich, you were out of balance. If you were poor, you were kind of living in a lack consciousness. If you were rich, you were greedy and selfish. It was out of balance. So again, everything was in balance. So let me talk a little bit about what we have lost. I found that the lost scrolls empower us as individuals. They bring us back to ourselves. They teach us love on a much higher level. But more importantly, they even teach us to love ourselves, which seems to be a big key in knowing self, is loving self first. The greatest commandment in the Bible is to love God and to love our neighbor and to love ourselves. I know that it's much easier to love God than to love my neighbor, especially that guy that just cut me off a minute ago. And then again, it's much easier to love my neighbor than to love myself. But really, the scripture should read, love yourself first. If you can't love yourself, you will never love your neighbor. If you can't love your neighbor, it will be impossible to love God. It's a little bit different way of looking at it. They teach respect for the different races, cultures, religions, and respect for the female gender. Something that's been very severely lacking in our history, but especially in our religious history. They knew that souls were not sexed, and that the gender ascribed to the body is ultimately an illusion. Thus, women were considered equal to men. Some were revered as prophets, teachers, healers, priests. Although to be a leader in one sense of the word, in this case, they never made you that and separated you or made you superior. So their leaders were not superior. They were more in a place of service. So always keep that in mind. They never put anybody on a pedestal. White was just simply a symbol saying, here I am. I'm here to heal you, help you, feed you, whatever you need. They also knew that souls didn't have a color. So color or race, they knew was just an illusion of the masses. They teach respect for the animals because they saw the animals as our noble brothers. They never saw them as something to be used and abused. I've been told by people that, it says in the Old Testament that the animals were there for our service, basically. They're not. They were there. We were supposed to be stewards of the animals. And that's kind of like, we're not supposed to have dominion over them. We're not supposed to do things to them or use them. We're supposed to be servants to them, to love them, to make them like our children. That's very different. All life was sacred and respected above all else. You can see why, you understand when you start reading some of these scrolls, why Christ was so upset about going into the temples when what they were doing in the temples is they were sacrificing animals, which he didn't believe in. They would cut the animals up, and then they would sell it. That was the market inside the temple. They were butchers and sold the meat, and that was going on in the temple. So you can see how, coming from this place, how enraged he would have been from that alone. They kind of took Christ off the pedestal and down from heaven and out of the cradle where Christianity had put him, where you would recognize him more as a complete human, where he was completely human and completely divine at the same time. Definitely not separate from us. He was to be a pattern, an example, someone who we were all to gravitate to as we evolved. This was actually, they actually had a word for it called anthropos. They believed that God in form was paramount in their beliefs. The marriage of spirit and matter was understood principle for them. The law of one was basic information. I am, one God, one of us, one spirit. That was basic for them. We are all individuals and yet unique, but completely one. This was also the basis for knowing self. They never had any hierarchy of organized religion where bishops, cardinals, priests, preachers, or anyone could possibly be placed above their own self as being somehow closer to the divine. There was nothing closer than your heart to the divine. Gnosis was a principle of their every thought. Einstein once said, I want to know God's thoughts. Everything else is just details. Which is interesting, you know. That's kind of how we all should feel. The Essenes embodied this. To them, everything could only be realized and find expression within the human heart and spirit. A quote from the Gospels of Peter, as long as we use words, we will have evils. This may have been why they strayed from the Torah, because it had become the letter of the law and had deadly repercussions, even back in their days, 2,000 years ago. Spiritual knowledge within the Essenes was passed by word of mouth, and only then when it was confirmed by the heart. However, once Yahshua was taken and killed, it became a well-defined system that was established that every member of the community was to record their experiences in the spiritual plane and their initiation into the divine mysteries. To write about the teachers like Christ and the disciples who had been speaking. And this was a big dilemma for them at the time. This is actually from one of their writings. Many things have been written because they are true, but they are not true because they were written, but were written because they are true. They were starting to live this. We want you to know God from your heart, but now we're being forced to write it down because they know that they're going to take these truths away from us. This is why the scrolls were hidden the way they were and why they were lost. Humans are powerful spiritual beings created to hold God in their physical form and to move as such with this direct connection. That we come into this realm of good and evil, the realm of darkness, to learn how to love greater than the angels. And this is in their writings as well. You may be starting to see the power behind these lost scrolls, these lost texts. H. Miller once said, one's destination is never a place, but rather a new way of looking at things. Some of us are starting to look at things different, thus creating the new age of enlightenment. It's not a place, but a new awareness of who we are. The Essenes or Gnostics wrote to help us reach this new age. So it's my hope and prayer that even though this has been very brief, that some of this has touched your heart. Because I have seen so many things that have been changed within the scriptures, I ask if I could read as kind of a closing prayer, the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic. So there's interpretations of the Lord's Prayer. We should all know the Lord's Prayer. Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. But the Lord's Prayer is very different in Aramaic, which was the language that Christ was using at the time. Now, the scrolls are actually written in Aramaic, Greek, Coptic Greek, and then eventually Hebrew. So they're finding them in very many languages. So I'm going to read the Lord's Prayer. This is my closing prayer. O birther, Father, Mother of the cosmos, you create all that moves in light. Focus your light within us. Make it useful as the rays of a beacon show the way. Create your reign of unity now through our fiery hearts and our willing hands. Your one desire then acts with ours, as in all light, so in all forms. Grant what we need each day in bread and insight, subsistence for this call of growing life. Loose the cords of mistakes binding us as we release the strands we hold of others' guilt. Don't let us enter forgetfulness, but break the hold of unripeness. From you is born all ruling will, the power and the life to do, the song that beautifies all, from age to age it renews. Truly, power to these statements. May they be the source from which all our actions grow, sealed in trust and faith. Amen. You can see the power behind it, adding those extra words. Thank you. Namaste. And my books that are about, I have some books back there. They're just my experiences, and I hope somebody else could learn from those experiences. They sell for $12.95. They're actually on Amazon. I didn't come here to sell anything. If anybody wants one and can't afford it, you can have one. It's mostly I wrote it to share.